Howdy my friends, and welcome to the channel today. I'm Luke, Thunderhead289 here on YouTube, and today we're going back to school. We're going to go through the process of making all the pre-adjustment settings to a carburetor before we install it, and take a look at our ignition timing and that stuff, and then install the carburetor and go through some of the adjustments to get everything dialed in so that essentially you can install a carburetor, set your timing, and drive a vehicle. So every time I rebuild a carburetor, I always pick a test rig to go through, make sure the rebuild was good. So that's what was on the Maverick here a bit ago. So we're going to throw our original unit back on and just go through all the settings with you guys. So, at home, when you do a carb swap or whatever you're doing, it can just be that much easier for you. So with that, let's jump right in, my friends. So first things first here, some of the things that you're going to need to be able to do this. Obviously, you're going to need a screwdriver. I like these multi-bit units because, they have a lot of functionality for what they are. Just a standard vacuum gauge, and then a timing light. Now I prefer to have a dial back timing light, and I'll explain in a moment here, but they're very handy for a lot of reasons, and I'll leave the link below to this one that I use. I've had pretty good luck with that guy, and it sure doesn't break the bank. But anyway, they're very handy if your harmonic balancer is dirty, your timing marks are all rusted up, it's hard to see. And as long as you have the TDC mark, top dead center mark, on your balancer that you can visually see, then you can go through all of your timing settings just fine. And I'll leave a link below to the video of how to find true TDC and mark it in case you can't see it on your harmonic balancer or whatever. And it goes through in depth, and you can figure out how to do that pretty easy. But on this one, I've already done that, and it's marked and we can see it. So I'm going to treat this kind of like a first start, like you just installed your distributor, you don't know where your timing marks are, and you just want to have a leg up on getting everything set up correctly. So the first thing you want to do is get to top dead center on your crank of your harmonic balancer here. The cylinder 1 piston is going to come up twice on our harmonic balancer, but there's one in particular that we are looking for. Obviously it comes up on the exhaust stroke to push the exhaust out, and then once on the compression stroke. Now what we're looking for is the compression stroke. So there's two ways that are very simple to do this. You can, one, pull your valve cover, and when both of your rocker arms are not compressed, they're not opening a valve, when you're coming up on your timing mark here, that's TDC. But what you can also do is take your spark plug number 1 out, put your finger over the hole here, and just turn the engine over manually, and then you'll start to feel the engine pushing air through your finger here, or past your finger, which we have going on right now. You can hear it there. Reason being, again, both your valves are closed, and this is the only place the air can escape. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn my crank to where it's about 10 degrees on the harmonic balancer here, and I'll show you a trick that works on not all distributors, but a lot of them, and you can be that much closer to having your timing in a position where the engine will run right when you fire up the engine. Alright, so there's a quick look down there. You can kind of see the timing pointer lining up with 10 degrees, which is somewhere where the engine will at least try and run there to some capacity. Now if you just stabbed in your distributor and you want to make sure that everything's in the right place here, a quick verification is you can have your distributor cap loose, maybe. And so this is our spark plug number 1 lead here. And if we pull this away, we can see that the rotor is pointing to where we want it to. Now if you're 180 off, obviously that's going to not be pointing at the number 1 cylinder in any way, shape, or form. So about that timing trick here, let me get this hooked back on, and then I'll show you that little guy that can come in handy. Okay, so this works on some distributors, not all. Definitely all points distributors it works on. Pertronics I've had good luck with, but some MSDs you can't do this trick. And if you followed everything at the beginning of this video, you should be okay. But this is an extra verification that you can do just to see if things are close. So we have our spark plug wire number 1 here going to our number 1 spark plug that I had taken out to make sure we were at top dead center there. And then I have it grounded here to this Jenko grounding cable that the previous owner had installed. And anyway, what you can do is actually rotate the distributor, and when it crosses the proper point, obviously I have the key on, okay, so we have key on, it's hot to the coil of our HEI unit here, And so you can rotate the distributor, and when you get to the right point where everything aligns, this spark plug will actually spark. And if you stop right then, you know that whatever degree you have down on your crank, so say I have it sitting at 15 degrees and I'm turning this guy and it sparks, you know that right there where the distributor is, that's 15 degrees of initial timing, or very close to it. But it gives you a very solid starting point for when you fire it for the first time. You're not, you know, frantically turning the distributor all over the place like I see in so many folks' first start videos. That's bad. We don't want to do that. All right, and you can see as I rotate the distributor, you know, you can get the spark plug to spark. So anyway, I've done that and I've made a mark because I knew I'd be fooling with it for this video here and not have enough hands. So right there should be pretty darn close. All right, so we're going to take a look at the carb, specifically the transfer slots, before we go ahead and install it. And a lot of folks on here know that I preach these transfer slots, but you know, a lot of TV shows and stuff, they're all about power numbers, but what are you and I doing most of the time? We drive our stuff on the road every day. That's what I do. This Maverick's my daily driver, and I'm all about drivability. Drivability 100% comes first because that's where we spend most of our time with this stuff. So these transfer slots, this piece is very important to drivability, and in keeping with this stuff, making sure it's all correct, you know, you're maintaining the original design dynamics of the way the carburetor was supposed to function, and it will return good off-idle performance for you. So let's take a look at this son of a gun. All right, so taking a look at the underside of our carburetor here, our primaries are up top, and when I'm talking transfer slots, what we're talking about is this slot in the bore of the carburetor, which handles some of the off-idle transition fueling of the engine. Now, if you have too much of this exposed, what you're going to have happen is you're going to have weird lean bogs. People try and band-aid it with accelerator pumps and everything, and typically Holleys come pretty darn good from the factory. And I always say carburetors are very forgiving. Ignition timing is where all your performance comes from, and so you really don't want to be chasing things around, band-aiding them. Really what you're looking for with this throttle blade setting is you want to be somewhere pretty close to a square. As you see here, that's what we have right now. Obviously, the more you open the throttle with your curb idle screw, the more of that exposure you're going to have, and the less of that transfer slot you're going to have when you open the throttle and make the transition to going down the road. Now, one other mistake that a lot of folks tend to make is they set this with their choke on. You know, if you have an electric choke, you need to lock this out. So obviously here you can see we're not moving the throttle and they're way exposed. But with the choke closed off, you know, this is where you want to make all your adjustments. Now, one more thing here, I want you to observe that little port that's right when you open the throttle. You can see it there in the center of the bore. That is actually the port for your ported or timed vacuum, and that's going to become important as we move through the video. So I want you to remember where that is in relation to our throttle, and you can see if you open your throttle too much, that would be exposed to vacuum at your idle setting, which is what you don't want. So keep that in mind as we move forward. All right, so the last thing we're going to do before we install our carburetor is we're going to preset our mix screws to give us somewhere to go. So the first thing you want to do is you want to turn these all the way in, which would be obviously all the way like you're tightening it in to the right here. And one thing you want to be mindful of is you don't want to, you know, really jam this thing in there. It'll ruin your mix screws, ruin the mix screw seat, and it'll never quite fuel correctly ever again. So what we're going to do is we're going to just take it, we're going to start at, you know, maybe 1.5 turns out. I know this engine takes a little bit less than that even, but typically I always try and go on the rich side, because then we know we're going to lean it up. You know, we know what direction we're going to go as we get it dialed in, and so it cuts out a lot of the guesswork. So 1.5 to 2 turns typically. This one we're going to go 1.5. So I can do this with my non-dominant hand here. That's a half turn, that's 1 full turn, and then that's another half turn. Now we want to do that equally on both sides. Whatever you do to one side of the carburetor, obviously you want to do to the other side as well. All right, so getting the carb installed here. You'll notice I have a little carb spacer. This is an insulative composite style. You can get phenolic or however it's pronounced style units, and basically it just creates a nice barrier between the engine heat and the carburetor to not give you, you know, some very interesting carburetor anomalies with the way the fuel is today. You know, it's just real volatile, and the more heat you can keep out of the carburetor, the more consistent temp you can keep the thing, just the better overall your performance will be. So I always recommend either a composite carb spacer like this guy here or a phenolic unit. It just pays dividends in the end. And I know you're all already probably dogging on me in the comments about the wire management on this engine or just the overall appearance. And I'll preface this. I bought this car with this engine in it, and I actually bought it for the aluminum heads, and it has a 4-speed close ratio top loader, and I paid $1,700 for the car. And originally it was just going to be a parts car. I was going to pull these aluminum heads off and, you know, do something with the top loader and whatever and just part the car out. But like all other things, you know, kind of got it tuned in, put my own carburetor and distributor in it, kind of liked it, drove it all winter, and now it's my daily driver. So it's kind of funny how some of that goes. But anyway, here, last piece with installing the unit. A big mistake that a lot of folks make is they really crank on these carb nuts. You know, it's very easy to warp the flange. I mean, these are made out of like pot metal, okay? It's very easy to warp the flange on the base of the carburetor, and then you have a nice, awesome vacuum leak that's very annoying. So, you know, it's just tight enough to seal. You know, you don't want to gorilla arm the thing, and then you're good to go. So, you know, like that, that's absolutely plenty. That thing's bolted down, it's not going anywhere, and it's good and sealed. Alright, so before we start this thing up, let's take a look at ignition timing. There's a lot of discussion about ported versus manifold vacuum. Now, you know, it really depends on your engine setup, your engine combo, what your distributor is capable of for advance, and a lot of things there. But more often than not, if you have a street car, you're going to end up, if you want the most performance, you're going to end up running ported vacuum. So with this particular HEI distributor, let's take a look at the mechanical timing curves and an understanding of what's going on with the timing. And then we'll explain why ported vacuum is probably the right choice for this engine. All right, so taking a look at this aftermarket HEI unit, which the numbers with this guy are pretty synonymous with all other aftermarket HEIs. So what this one in particular has on it, and I have tested it with a timing light, is about 15 degrees of mechanical advance capable. So say we were to set our initial timing to 15 degrees mechanical, basically when you rev the engine up, all in, our total timing would be about 30 degrees. And of course we would check that with the timing light. So you know, you might ask, well, that's why I don't like vacuum advance. It's adding too much timing, you know, and there's just a whole bunch of funny misunderstandings about vacuum advance. So we'll try and just break it down for you very quickly. So vacuum advance on aftermarket units typically adds about 8 to 15 degrees of additional timing to your engine, but it's vacuum advance. It works solely off of vacuum. Now think of your engine. When you open the throttle, what happens to your vacuum? It's going to drop. So vacuum advance has about a threshold where at 8 to 12 inches of mercury, they're typically somewhere in there. Anything below that point, and that timing is pulled out of the engine. So you might ask, well, hey, you know, I guess I don't understand why it adds timing and then pulls it away. Now what you need to understand about an engine is it is nothing but a giant air pump, and your carburetor kind of works like your valve on your air pump. So the more vacuum you have, that's kind of a good indicator of resistance to flow. Now why does that matter for vacuum advance? Well, think of it this way. A more dense air fuel charge, you know, more particles, more mass packed together is going to have a much faster burn rate than a less dense charge. The particles are farther apart. It takes the flame propagation within the cylinder longer time to jump from particle to particle to particle on a less dense charge. So, you know, if you're just cruising around, you don't have a lot of throttle input. Think of, you know, your volumetric fill that you're getting on your cylinder. It's not that much. It's not a very dense charge. So you're adding ignition timing by vacuum advance at these points so that you're still firing your mixture at a good, efficient time. And that's why on a street car, you definitely want to have vacuum advance. You're just leaving economy and efficiency on the table if you're not utilizing it on a street car. So, and then again, once you open the throttle, obviously your cylinder pressures are going to go up, your volumetric fill is much, much higher, and then that timing is pulled out, and you know, you're still, it's not about timing advance, it's about firing the mixture at the right time in the cylinder stroke. So depending on what your cylinder charge is and the time it takes to burn that charge, you know, your ignition timing can vary for the most optimum time to fire that charge, if that makes any sense. So that's kind of the reason for Vacuum Advance. So let's take a look again at where I'm going to go for with this distributor, and why I'm going to run probably ported or timed vacuum with this particular HEI, and why if you have one of these you probably should too. Okay, so now remember, we only have 15 degrees of mechanical advance in this distributor, meaning from whatever we set at initial, it's only going to bring in another 15 degrees of timing. Now here's why we're going to run ported vacuum and not manifold vacuum. You know, this is a fairly stock engine, it has aluminum heads and whatever, but it does not take a whole lot of timing at idle, you know, to have a good idle RPM and good idle characteristics. So what people typically do, and the mistake they make with stuff like this, is they will hook it to manifold vacuum, and then they'll adjust their timing. Remember, manifold, you know, on your Vacuum Advance port here, you're adding about 8 to 15 degrees of advance. And so what happens is they set that where the engine runs very happy, but where you're at idle is a combination between, if you're on manifold advance, it's a combination of your initial mechanical and your vacuum advance. And what typically happens is you end up with a very low mechanical advance number. Now remember what we said about how vacuum advance works. When you open the throttle hard, your vacuum advance goes completely out the window. So then what you're relegated to is only your mechanical advance. And if you're sitting somewhere at like 4 degrees of initial mechanical, it's going to be super late. When you really open up the throttle, it's going to be a complete dog. And I've seen this a ton of times on Power Tour and helped a lot of folks, you know, retune their engine and then get a lot more performance out of it. So anyway, that's why we're going to be on ported or timed advance on this engine. Now the only difference between the ported port on a carburetor and the full manifold port as far as a distributor and vacuum advance is concerned is that the ported or timed port does not have any vacuum at idle. Now remember, when we had our carburetor off, I pointed out a little port next to the transfer slots, and that port is what is associated with our timed spark port on our carburetor. Now if you have everything set up right, that port will not, again, it will not have any vacuum at idle. Now if you have too much throttle, you will see vacuum at idle past the vacuum threshold, and you'll start pulling timing from your vacuum advance. And that's a solid indicator actually that you have too much curb idle screw. And then you might ask, well, you know, I can't get the engine to idle at a high enough RPM, I need to add more idle screw. You actually don't. This is going to be our indicator, and you'll see here in a moment, that's going to be a solid indicator of how much initial mechanical timing we need to run. You'll notice that as we advance our ignition timing, our idle RPM will increase even with maintaining the curb idle screw setting. So with that, we're going to get everything started up here. Now what I'm going to do, since it's a first fire up here with this carburetor, I'm going to go ahead and turn this 1/2 turn more open. Maybe here, come on, non-dominant hand dexterity for the win. So anyway, we're about a 1/2 turn more open. That gives us a good buffer for firing up the engine, and we should be good to go. We have our vacuum gauge hooked to full manifold vacuum for some tuning, and I think we're ready to fire this thing up. All right, timing light is all hooked up. Our magnetic pickup on the guy is on spark plug wire number 1 here on our Ford, hooked up to the battery here. And I think we're good to go. All of our tools are nice and out of the way. This is going to take a second of cranking because the fuel bowls should be completely empty. So put her in neutral here. Gotta love that clutch pedal down there. The Maverick's pretty janko. That's the beauty of these beaters. You can just kind of do whatever you want to them. So I'm just gonna crank it over. It's gonna take a moment for fuel to get there. There we go, fuel up to the carburetor. I'm gonna hold it at some RPM. I don't have the choke set here. All right. Let's see if we'll kind of idle here. idling enough. All right, you'll have to enjoy this engine here with this this bum lifter. Annoying, but it still runs decent. So we're going to take our timing light right away, get a reading on our timing. And it looks like on the timing light here at 21 degrees, our TDC mark is lining up. So it's a little advanced. We're going to drop it down by turning our port distributor counterclockwise. You heard the engine idle drop. Down around about 15. Probably a little hefty yet. Drop her back a little bit more. All right. So now we're at about 10 degrees. Take a look at our vacuum gauge. It's reading dang steady at about 15. So now we're going to do the dance between our carburetor and our timing. We see we're still a little rich here. All right. So now remember, we added some to that curb idle screw. So what we're going to try and do is the balance between the curb idle screw and our initial mechanical timing. So you heard engine RPM drop when we reduce that guy. Sounds a little low at the moment. Sitting somewhere about 700-800 RPM. I'm gonna bump our ignition timing up. It's probably about 12 at the moment. You heard the engine RPM increase now. So we'll jump back in here. We'll lower it a bit more. Increase our initial mechanical. And it doesn't hurt while you're going through this. Every once in a while as you're changing so much stuff, to give the engine a few revs and clear everything out. Now, right now is where our transfer slot would be squared up. Gonna give it a little more timing here. You can tell our engine's kind of shaking around again, so we need to readdress our mix screws. And something to understand, every time you adjust that curb idle screw, because of that transfer slot, you're adding more or less fuel. So every time you make an adjustment there, you need to readdress your mixture screws. It's also a balance between those two. We'll find our timing light here. All right, we're at about 15 degrees, which remember, there's 15 degrees mechanical capable in that distributor. So if we have 15 initial, that's given us about 30 total on the top end. And you can see as we've been going, the engine's steadying out quite a bit. And you'll notice the closer we get to those transfer slots being correct, the much more snappy the throttle response is going to be. Not looking bad on our vacuum gauge. One thing to keep in mind, if you saw our vacuum gauge sits, you know, maybe 3 or 4 inches of mercury below zero when it's unhooked. And so right now we're probably sitting about 18 inches of mercury, and everything's looking pretty good. It's nice and steady, and that's what you want to see. So I want to show you something very interesting about that ported port. So I've taken my vacuum gauge and hooked it to the ported port on the carburetor. And you'll see right now, there's no vacuum. But if you watch that guy, open the throttle, you'll see that that vacuum's moving. Now, on our original setting, if we were to retard our timing back and add some of that Carb idle screw, you would see vacuum on that gauge. Heck, let me just do it really quick. It's kind of a nice indicator. If you're starting to see vacuum on your ported port, you know that you have too much Carb idle screw. You should not be seeing that. So with everything back to where it was, you'll notice if I hook up my vacuum advance, the engine idle characteristics and RPM doesn't change. Nothing changes because at idle, you're not getting anything from your vacuum advance. Where if you were, you can hear it. The engine will literally change its idle tone. So, something to keep in mind. She's idling pretty good behind me here. So if you've done everything right, you'll notice that your mix screws at this point are very touchy. A quarter of a turn will make a huge difference because they are what are responsible for adding most of the fuel at idle because you have your transfer slots set up correctly. Now all I do is I just start leaning them up until the engine kind of starts to break up, and every time I make a little adjustment, both of them being even, you crack the throttle a few times to blow everything out. See how it idles. If it's kind of breaking up, you know, I go lean until it starts breaking up, and then when I find that point where it starts to lose RPM, vacuum starts to get unsteady, I'll richen it up 1/8 of a turn at a time back until everything steadies out. And when you're done, you'll have a vacuum gauge that looks about like this. All right, so this is pretty much what you're looking for here. Nice and steady vacuum reading, even for an old piece of garbage wore out engine like this. Not bad. Remember, again, it's a little bit more than 15. It's probably 17 or 18 because this gauge is kind of funky. It sits below 0 when it's unhooked from everything, but everything seems to be running and idling good. Good throttle response. You can see the engine's nice and smooth now. All right, so we got everything good and reassembled here. We're in neutral. Fires right up with the turn of the key. And now, I'm gonna be kind of a cheater here. We can check our work. Little AFR gauge and vacuum gauge that I programmed into an app here. Some sensors on the car. We're not too bad, maybe a little lean. I have it at the moment, but it looks like we're on the upper end of 14, maybe dipping into 15. Like I said, with our vacuum, we're up around 18 or so. Pretty darn steady. I don't have any complaints about that. So it looked like our methodology with the vacuum gauge was pretty accurate. Yeah, we're looking pretty good. Has good throttle response. So I think at this point, I'm good to take her for a drive. Well, all right, my friends, that's really the long and short of it. I threw a lot of info there at you all at once, but you know, if you can kind of follow along, and I have little bits and pieces of each of these steps of the process in different independent videos. So I try to kind of all throw it together. This is why I typically don't, because you can see there's a lot of info and know-how that goes into all this stuff when it comes together. So with that, looks like our 600 double pumper is back on. She's nice and happy. Sounds happy at least. Yeah, we're good to go. I'll rip the rear end out of this thing. Good grief. But in doing things this way, you know, you have good off-idle performance, good cruisability. Everyone talks about these big power numbers. That's not what you're trying to do. You're trying to actually drive your car and have it run right. And you know, that's what I try and do for you. So good off-idle performance and good wide open throttle performance here. So I'll be there for a while. Now it's nice and smoky in here. It smells like old petrified tires. You see we can come right off a stop. No hesitation. Shift gears. No hesitation. Just runs like a car's supposed to run. So I think with that, my friends, that's going to do it for me. Thanks for coming along. I will say, if you have the opportunity or have the funds to pick up a wideband O2 sensor or gauge or whatever, I'll leave a link below, the one that I use, not the one that I made myself, but the ones I used to run my vehicles before I used to make them myself. And I mean, they're just a great tuning aid. You can see what's going on with the engine. Build and install a new engine, you're not going to ruin it because you know what your air-fuel ratio is all the time. So anyway, again, thanks for coming along. I'm Thunderhead289. We'll catch you for the next one.